In the autumn of 1972, in a bar called Andy Cap's Tavern on West El Camino Real in Sunnyvale, California, a 24-year-old engineer named Alan Alcorn received a phone call from the bar manager telling him the machine was broken. Alcorn had built the thing himself, a $75 Hitachi black and white television set, soldered into a 4-foot wooden cabinet, with a coin mechanism pulled from a laundromat and a milk carton placed inside to catch the quarters. The game on the screen was as simple as a game could be. 2 white paddles, a white square for a ball, and a dotted line down the center. The only instructions printed on the cabinet read, "Avoid missing ball for high score." Alcorn drove out to fix it, opened the cabinet, and found the problem. The milk carton had overflowed. Quarters had piled so high they had shorted out the coin mechanism. The machine was not broken, it was drowning in money. That overflowing milk carton in a Sunnyvale bar is the first heartbeat of a machine that would, within a single decade, build an industry worth more than Hollywood and the American recording business combined, all of it fed 1 quarter at a time. You're watching Digital Relics, where we trace the machines that reshaped everyday life all the way back to the first crude version and the people who built it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the beginning of the arcade machine is stranger and scrappier than the legend lets on. To understand what that overflowing milk carton meant, you have to see the world it was born into. Before Pong, the word arcade already existed, but it meant something different. It meant a row of pinball machines along a boardwalk, a strength tester at a carnival, a mechanical fortune teller behind glass, a jukebox in the corner of a diner. These were analog amusements, built from springs and solenoids and stamped metal, and they had held their ground for decades. Pinball alone was a $2 billion industry in the United States by the mid-1970s, with over 700,000 machines in operation. Some cities had banned pinball outright. New York from 1942 to 1976, on the grounds that it was a game of chance and therefore gambling. The machines survived lawsuits, moral panics, and the Depression. They were tough incumbents. The idea that a television screen could replace all of them would have struck most operators as absurd. And the reason it seemed absurd was simple. The only video game in the world, as of 1962, ran on a computer the size of 3 refrigerators. It was called Spaceware. It was programmed by a young computer scientist named Steve Russell and his colleagues at MIT, and it ran on a PDP-1 mini-computer that cost roughly $120,000. Russell and his team spent about 200 hours writing the code, 2 spaceships firing torpedoes at each other around a gravity well, and the game spread across university campuses, wherever a PDP-1 existed. Students loved it. They modified it, adding new features, a starfield backdrop that mapped actual constellations, a hyperspace button that flung your ship to a random location on the screen. It became the first piece of software people stayed up all night playing. But the machine it required cost more than a house. Nobody was going to stand one of those in a bar next to the jukebox and charge a quarter to play. The gap between a video game and a coin-operated cabinet was not a technical problem anyone had solved. It was a cost problem, and it looked permanent. The quarter that would later overflow a milk carton in Sunnyvale had nowhere to fall. 2 engineers working at an electronics company called Ampex in the late 1960s were about to close that gap, and the solution would not require a mainframe. It would require a television set and a circuit board built from parts you could buy at a hardware store. Nolan Bushnell had played Spaceware as a student at the University of Utah and had spent years thinking about how to make it cheap enough to run on a coin-operated machine. He had also worked summers at Lagoon Amusement Park in Utah, running the Midway Games, watching people feed coins into machines for 3 minutes of entertainment. He understood the economics of a quarter. His colleague, Ted Dabney, a self-taught electrical engineer and former United States Marine, had the insight that made it possible. Instead of using expensive microprocessors, Dabney designed a motion circuit from discrete electronic components, the kind of parts already mass-produced for consumer televisions. His circuit could move images on a screen without a computer. The cost dropped from 6 figures to something a small manufacturer could build. The two formed a partnership they called Syzygy Engineering, approached a local arcade game maker called Nutting Associates, and in November of 1971 shipped Computer Space, the first commercially sold arcade video game. Bushnell designed the cabinet himself, a futuristic shell of molded fiberglass in 4 colors, looking like it belonged on a science fiction film set rather than in a bar. Nutting produced around 1,500 units. The game sold roughly 1,300 of them. It was not a failure, but it was not the hit Nutting had hoped for. The controls were too complicated, the rules too unclear for a player dropping a quarter and expecting instant fun. Operators reported that players would stand in front of the cabinet, stare at it, and walk away without inserting a coin. The machine was beautiful and bewildering in equal measure. But the proof of concept was there. A video game could run on cheap hardware inside a coin-operated cabinet. And the person who had made the screen move, the engineer who had solved the foundational problem, was Ted Dabney. Bushnell, the showman and the visionary, would get the credit. Dabney, the circuit designer, would not. The lesson Bushnell took from Computer Space was ruthless and correct. The next game had to be so simple that a drunk person in a bar could understand it in seconds. On June 27, 1972, Bushnell and Dabney officially founded Atari, the name taken from the Japanese board game Go, where it signals a piece is about to be captured. They had wanted to use Syzygy, but a candle maker in San Francisco had already claimed it. Atari was their second choice, and it stuck. Their first hire was Alan Alcorn, a Berkeley-trained electrical engineer who had worked alongside them at Ampex. Alcorn had never designed a video game. Bushnell told him the project was a training exercise, a simple ball and paddle game, and even invented a fake contract with General Electric to make the assignment sound important. Alcorn took the exercise seriously, built the prototype by hand, soldered the circuits into that $75 Hitachi television, enclosed it in a wooden box, and added a sound chip that gave the paddles a satisfying electronic tone when the ball connected. He divided each paddle into 8 segments, so the angle of the ball's return changed depending on where it struck. A small design decision that gave the game its competitive depth. He placed the milk carton inside to catch the coins, screwed the cabinet to the top of a wine barrel at Andy Capp's Tavern, and left it there. 2 weeks later, the call came. The machine was broken. The milk carton was full. Pong was released commercially on November 29, 1972, at a price of $700 per cabinet. Atari sold over 8,000 units within the first year, assembling them in a converted roller skating rink near their Santa Clara office. The production line was chaotic. Workers soldered circuit boards by hand, many of them hired off the street with no electronics experience. Bushnell later described the early operation as closer to a commune than a factory. But Atari never patented the game. Dozens of imitators flooded the market within months. Magnavox sued, arguing that Bushnell had seen their Odyssey console's table tennis game at a trade show and borrowed the concept. Atari settled. The clones kept coming. By 1977, the market was so saturated with paddle games that the industry stumbled into its first downturn. And by then, the man who had designed the circuit that made it all possible was gone. Ted Dabney learned that Bushnell had filed the original patent for their shared work under Bushnell's name alone. Frustrated and increasingly sidelined in the company he had co-founded, Dabney sold his stake in Atari for $250,000 in 1973. He left the video game industry. He spent the rest of his working life running a grocery store and deli in Northern California with his wife. He died of esophageal cancer on May 26, 2018, at the age of 81. The world remembers Nolan Bushnell. The engineer who made the screen move is a footnote, and honest history owes him more than that. But the real earthquake that rescued the arcade from its first slump did not come from California. It was being built in a Tokyo laboratory by a single engineer who designed both the hardware and the software himself, and it was about to prove that a quarter dropped into a machine was not a fad. It was a new human habit. In 1978, an engineer at Taito named Tomohiro Nishikado completed a game he had been building alone for roughly 18 months. He had designed custom circuit boards because the existing hardware was not fast enough to do what he wanted, and he had drawn the enemy sprites himself, replacing his original human targets, which Taito management considered too aggressive, with aliens inspired by H.G. Wells and the science fiction wave that Star Wars had set in motion. The game was Space Invaders. When Taito released it in Japan in July of 1978, the response was not simply commercial success, it was a national event. Dedicated Space Invaders arcades opened across Japan. Some of them converted from coffee shops and pachinko parlors that could not compete with the draw of the new machines. Taito sold 100,000 machines in the first year alone, generating $600 million in revenue. The game was licensed to Midway for the American market and reached the United States by October. By 1982, Space Invaders had grossed an estimated $3.8 billion worldwide, and roughly 360,000 cabinets had been sold. The story most often told about that era is that Space Invaders caused a shortage of 100 yen coins in Japan, that the machines consumed so many coins that banks could not keep up. The documented record is thinner, and honesty requires a flag here. Coin production figures show that the mint actually produced fewer 100 yen coins in 1978 and 79 than in surrounding years, and arcade operators would have recycled the coins through banks, not hoarded them. This story was likely amplified by Taito's own marketing. But the fact that the myth was plausible, that people believed a single game could drain a country's coin supply, is itself the measure of how completely Space Invaders consumed a culture. Nishikado's game also carried an accident that became a signature. The processor he had built could not render all the aliens at full speed. As the player destroyed more of them, the fewer remaining sprites moved faster because the hardware had less work to do. The game got harder as you won. Nishikado saw it, recognized it as a feature rather than a flaw, and left it in. That unintended acceleration is still the template for difficulty curves in games built half a century later. Space Invaders did something no game before it had done. It turned the arcade from a curiosity into an industry. Machine sales in the United States jumped from $50 million in 1978 to $900 million by 1981. The number of dedicated arcades in North America more than doubled. The quarter was no longer falling into a milk carton, it was falling into a system, and the system was growing faster than anyone had predicted. And then, in a Namco office in Tokyo, a 24-year-old designer named Taru Iwatani sat down, looked at a pizza with a slice missing, and saw the shape of a character that would become more famous than most film stars on Earth. The story everyone tells about Pac-Man begins with a pizza. Toru Iwatani has said in interviews that he looked at a pie with a slice removed and saw a mouth, and that image became the character. The reality, as Iwatani himself has acknowledged, is messier. The pizza was one source among several. The Japanese character for mouth, the onomatopoeia paku paku, the sound of repeated chewing, and a deliberate desire to design something that was not a spaceship or a gun, all fed the same idea. Iwatani was 24, 3 years out of school, and his brief from Namco was specific: make a game that would attract women and couples to arcades dominated by young men playing shooters. He spent about 17 months on the design with a team of fewer than 10 people. He gave each of the 4 ghosts its own personality and chase algorithm, so that Blinky pursued directly, Pinky tried to ambush, Inky behaved unpredictably, and Clyde wandered. The maze had 240 dots, 4 power pellets, and a fruit bonus that appeared twice per level. Every element was calibrated to keep a player alive just long enough to want another quarter. The original Japanese name was Pac-Man, derived from Paku Paku. When Bally's Midway division prepared the American release, they changed it to Pac-Man, worried that vandals would scratch the P on the cabinet into a different letter. The rename stuck, and a cultural phenomenon attached itself to a name chosen to prevent graffiti. Namco launched Pac-Man in Japan on May 22, 1980. The Japanese response was modest. Then, the American release arrived in October, and the scale of what happened next was unlike anything the industry had seen. Within a year, Midway had sold over 100,000 cabinets in the United States alone. The game was generating an estimated $1 billion per year in American quarters. By 1982, Americans were spending $6 billion a year playing Pac-Man and its spin-offs, more than they spent in Las Vegas casinos and movie theaters combined. The Guinness Book of World Records would eventually certify Pac-Man as the most successful coin-operated game in history, with 293,822 cabinets installed worldwide within 7 years. A survey found that 94% of American consumers recognized the character, a figure most Hollywood studios could not match with their biggest stars. There was a Pac-Man cartoon, a Pac-Man cereal, a Pac-Man lunchbox, and a novelty song called Pac-Man Fever by Buckner and Garcia that reached number 9 on the Billboard chart in 1982. A yellow circle with a missing wedge had become the most recognizable face in American entertainment. And the numbers around Pac-Man were not isolated. They were the peak of a wave that had lifted the entire industry to a height no one had forecast. By 1982, there were 24,000 dedicated arcades across North America, 400,000 additional street locations, grocery stores, laundromats, gas stations, restaurants, even funeral homes, and 1.5 million arcade machines in active operation. The United States arcade industry was generating $8 billion a year. To hold that number up against its neighbors, American cinema box office revenue was lower. The recording industry was lower. The arcade machine, fed 1 quarter at a time by teenagers and office workers and truck drivers and grandmothers, had quietly become the single largest entertainment business in the country. 500,000 new machines were sold in 1982 alone, at prices ranging up to $3,000 each. The sales of arcade machines had leapt from $50 million in 1978 to $900 million in 1981. In 4 years, the industry had multiplied by a factor of 18. Not all of those machines were American. In 1981, a young industrial designer at Nintendo named Shigeru Miyamoto was handed a problem no one else wanted. Nintendo's American division had imported 3,000 units of an arcade game called Radarscope. The game flopped. 2,000 cabinets sat unsold in a warehouse in Tukwila, Washington. Miyamoto, who had never designed a video game, who had studied industrial design and wanted to make toys, was asked to create something new that could be loaded onto the unsold hardware. He built a game with a story, one of the first arcade games to have one. A carpenter, originally called Jumpman, later renamed Mario after Mario Segale, the landlord of Nintendo of America's warehouse, climbs ladders and jumps barrels to rescue a woman from a giant ape. He called it Donkey Kong, a name he intended to mean stubborn gorilla, arrived at with a Japanese to English dictionary. Nintendo of America's staff thought the name was ridiculous. They were overruled. The first units were loaded into the leftover Radarscope cabinets and placed in a bar called the Spot Tavern in Seattle. The first day, the machine took in $30. The second day, it broke down. Too many quarters had caused a short circuit, the same symptom a decade later, as the milk carton in Andy Capp's Tavern. Donkey Kong went on to sell over 132,000 cabinets worldwide. Nintendo was selling 4,000 units a month. The game generated over $100 million in profit in its first year and rescued the company from the edge of irrelevance in the American market. And the carpenter with the red cap and the mustache, designed because the pixel resolution was too low to render a mouth or hair, became the most famous character in the history of video games. But the very thing that made the Arcade King, The sheer volume of machines flooding every available surface in America was already planting the seeds of what came next. By 1983, the arcade industry was choking on its own success. The market was saturated with machines. Too many manufacturers were shipping too many games, many of them low-quality clones, riding the wave of whatever had been popular the previous season. Operators who had invested heavily in new cabinets found their returns falling as novelty wore off, and players drifted. At the same time, the Atari 2600 home console was in 8 million living rooms, and the same titles that had drawn players to arcades, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Asteroids, could now be played at home, imperfectly but conveniently. The home port of Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, rushed to market and visibly inferior to the arcade version, sold 7 million copies anyway. The convenience of the couch was beginning to outweigh the quality of the cabinet. Arcade revenue in the United States dropped from $8 billion in 1981 to $5 billion in 1983, a decline of 35% in 2 years. More than 1,500 arcades closed. Bally's amusement division, which had ridden the boom to $600 million in 1982, collapsed to $24 million by 1987. The home console market cratered even harder. Revenue fell from $3.2 billion in 1982 to roughly $100 million by 1985, a 97% drop that nearly destroyed the entire concept of the home video game. When Nintendo released the NES in North America in 1985, designed deliberately to avoid the mistakes that had caused the crash, it revived home gaming but pulled another generation of players further from the arcade. The living room was learning to do what the cabinet had done, and it was getting better at it every year. The arcade was not dead. It was waiting for one more game, and when that game arrived, it proved that there was still something a living room could never replicate. The opponent standing right next to you, both of you with quarters on the glass. In February of 1991, Capcom released Street Fighter II into American arcades, and the effect was immediate. Players lined up at cabinets, stacking quarters along the bottom edge of the screen to claim the next fight, a ritual that had no equivalent at home. The game had 8 selectable characters, each with a distinct fighting style and a set of special moves executed through precise joystick and button combinations that players taught each other, hoarded, and debated. Mastering a character took weeks. Beating the best player at your local arcade took longer. The game sold over 60,000 original cabinets worldwide, a number that was extraordinary by the standards of the early 90s, when 4,000 units constituted a hit. Across all its updated versions, Champion Edition, Turbo, Super, the total reached over 200,000 cabinets and an estimated $10 billion in cumulative revenue. Street Fighter II did not just sell machines. It revived the social architecture of the arcade itself, the crowd gathered around a single screen. The next challenger stepping up, the winner holding the cabinet. For a few years, the arcade felt alive again. Mortal Kombat followed, with its digitized actors and its graphic fatalities that triggered congressional hearings, and the creation of the ESRB rating system. NBA Jam, released in 1993, grossed $1 billion in its first year. The fighting game era proved that the arcade could still do one thing the home could not: put two strangers shoulder to shoulder in a contest that mattered, with an audience watching. But the revival was a reprieve, not a reversal. Home consoles grew more powerful with each generation. The gap between what an arcade cabinet could render and what a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64 could deliver shrank, then vanished, then inverted. The internet arrived and made the opponent in the next city as reachable as the one standing at the next cabinet. Online multiplayer did not replicate the feeling of standing next to your opponent, but it was available at midnight in your living room, and that turned out to matter more. By 1999, United States arcade revenue had fallen to $1.3 billion, a fraction of the 8 billion it had reached 17 years earlier. The standalone arcade machine did not die in a single dramatic collapse. It faded, game by game, location by location, as the living room and then the pocket absorbed everything the cabinet had once been the only place to find. The arcade machine took the joystick. It took the screen, it took the scoreboard, the high score table, the soundtrack, the character, and the quarter-fed challenge. The smartphone took all of them back. It took the joystick and made it a thumb on glass. It took the screen and made it 5 inches across and always in your pocket. It took the scoreboard and connected it to every player on Earth. It took the quarter and replaced it with nothing, or with a microtransaction, which may be worse. Everything the arcade machine built migrated into a device that fits in a palm, and the cabinet that started it all became a relic. But the relic refuses to disappear. Original 1980s arcade cabinets now sell for $5,000 to $15,000, and fully restored machines command more. An original Pong prototype sold at auction in 2022 for over $270,000. The Barcade, a bar built around vintage arcade cabinets, grew as a concept by 35% in 2023 alone, driven by adults who remember the machines and younger visitors who find something in the physical cabinet that a touchscreen cannot reproduce. The weight of the joystick, the clatter of the buttons, the glow of the cathode ray tube, the fact that the machine is right there, bolted to the floor, not minimized behind an app. Companies like Arcade 1-Up sell 3/4 scale replicas for living rooms, and entertainment chains anchor their floors with classic and modern machines side by side. Competitive fighting game communities still gather around arcade format setups, the ritual of the quarter on the glass surviving decades after the quarter itself became unnecessary. And the pixel art aesthetic of the golden age, the blocky ghosts, the simple ships, the maze seen from above, has become a visual language recognized worldwide, a shorthand for the idea of a game itself. The machines that survive are not museum pieces behind glass. They are being played. The people restoring them are not preserving a dead industry. They are refusing to let it become one. A milk carton filled with quarters in a Sunnyvale bar in 1972. A wooden box with a $75 television inside it and 2 white paddles on the screen. That is where it starts. From that cabinet, an industry grew that peaked at $8 billion a year, put 1.5 million machines in every corner of American life, gave the world Pac-Man and Space Invaders and Donkey Kong, taught a generation to compete for the cost of a quarter, outlasted 2 crashes and 3 decades of home consoles trying to replace it, and then watched everything it held walk out the door and into the palm of every hand on Earth. The arcade machine took a quarter at a time and built an empire worth more than Hollywood and the music business combined. And when the quarters finally stopped falling, the games did not die. They just moved into every screen on the planet, and the cabinet that started it all became the thing people drive across a state to find, restore, and play again. If you ever lined up at a cabinet with a quarter on the glass, drop a comment below. Tell us the game, the year, and the arcade. The people who played these machines know more about what they meant than anyone who ever sold them. If this is the kind of history you want to keep hearing, subscribe to Digital Relics and stay with us. We have the origin of another everyday machine coming next, and you will not want to miss where it began.